Welcome to British American Mercantilism and the Making of Empire. This is Melinda Cole Klein. In this colonial, entrepreneurial, pre-industrial society, three types of economies existed. It is important to note almost all economies were run and managed out of the family home until industrialism took hold in America after the War of 1812. This resulted in a transition to a wage labor economy. Working outside of the home for hourly wages, such as in factories, began in the 1820s through the 1840s. This was complete by 1900. Number one, the seafaring economy. This involved the carrying of goods, from dried fish to indentured servants or slaves to furniture. Merchant traders shipping goods belonged to this economy. Number two, home economies. This included agricultural farmers, dairy and cheese makers, midwives, and other professionals offering services, from physicians to lawyers. Number three included urban craft artisans, those providing services and products, from the making of hats to the construction of masts, and supplies such as those stocking ships for their long journey. From the founding of the American colonies, land was cheap and abundant, while labor was scarce, and when available, it was expensive. This made wages high for business-minded individuals in need, such as the shipbuilding craftsman or the tobacco planter. Colonial New England, in direct contrast to the Chesapeake Bay areas of Virginia and Maryland, and port cities on the Delaware River, relied only slightly on the labor of slaves or indentured servants. However, the most prevalent form of unfree labor operating in New England was the apprenticeship system, established to educate the youth. The apprenticeship system goes back at least to the 13th century in England. A young person, boy or girl, lived with a master for a period of years, learning a trade until 24 years old, after which time the youth was free to ply the trade they learned. But apprenticeship did not relieve the labor shortage in the colonies. For those bound laborers, such as indentured servants and slaves, they might have learned some skill in the trade of their master, but this education was not promised or intended, only a byproduct of the experience in the service of their master. Only through a recognized apprenticeship could a young man or woman hope to be recognized with economic skills. Thus, in the 13 British colonies, number one, entrepreneurial business practices was prevalent as a form of the economic base. Number two, free labor was scarce and expensive. Logical path for any free immigrant or former apprentice, or for that matter a runaway slave or indentured servant, any man or woman who had recognized skills set up shop or a home business for themselves rather than working for wages for someone else. Number three, there were four labor forms that existed in colonial British America. The first one was apprenticeship. Second, free labor. Third, slave labor. And four, this would be bonded labor, including convicts and indentured servants. Mercantilism and the making of empire. Mercantilism. This economic theory dominated European trading nations such as Britain, France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic. This economic philosophy supported the idea that to become a wealthy nation, it needed to limit the amount of manufactured goods being imported into the country and excel at the exportation of manufactured goods from within the country. One factor that significantly helped nations to acquire raw materials to be made into manufactured goods at low prices was to create colonies of their own. When nations such as Britain, France, the Dutch Republic, and/or Spain established colonies around the world and settled these colonies for the most part with their own people, these colonists extracted raw materials such as timber that would in time become furniture or ships. This raw material product was processed and shipped back to the colonial homeland for complete manufacture. Economically, this made sense. Rather than doing business with other European nations, this cuts out the middleman. Goods shipped directly from the grower, farmer, or lumber mill. Homeland governments could control prices for raw materials provided by their own colonies. All in all, to become a wealthy nation, homeland governments needed to create colonies to provide raw materials to their businesses. The colonies in turn served as consumers of these manufactured goods. In the 13 colonies, manufacturing was against the law. Thus, colonists had to limit the processing of raw materials into finished goods. Some raw materials, such as whale oil and sugar, necessitated processing because of spoilage that would occur during shipment to London or another European port. However, urban shops and distilleries produced finished products for local consumption and trade, but nothing on a large scale. The growing middle class made their money by shipping goods and services over long distances. These merchant traders made hefty profits. The British government knew it was critical to their economic health to sell their manufactured goods to foreigners and colonials, but not import their finished goods. Therefore, the theory of mercantilism appealed to economists and the English government, because if natural resources could be procured in the colonies for manufacture in England, and then shipping back to the colonies to buy the finished products, the profits would be huge. Belief in mercantilism began to slip in the late 1700s, but continued to be popular well into the 1800s, during the age of the sail. The economic treatise by Adam Smith, known as The Wealth of Nations, first published in 1776, advocated free trade and commerce, and that it would be free trade that would lead nations to limitless profits. In time, this economic philosophy emerged in America after the Revolution, then becoming popular with other industrial nations by the late 19th century. The headright system was a royal immigration scheme that worked. This system encouraged resident colonists to pay the transportation costs of immigrants wishing to come to America, but whom could not afford it. This labor land grant system placed the immigrant under an indenture averaging 5 to 7 years for exchange of transportation. The royal government, as a perk, offered the established colonists a grant of free land. This system was popular in Virginia and Maryland. Most land grants or headrights were about 50 acres. This system allowed for some families to amass large plantations. When the indentured servant became free, he or she was not to receive the headright. This grant of land belonged to the family or person who paid for the immigrant's transportation to America. As the Chesapeake colonies needed a more stable source of labor, in time they turned to the importation of African slaves. This was especially true for one-crop economies producing tobacco, sugar, and rice. About 2/3 of all white immigrants coming to America from Europe were bound laborers. This would include indentured servants and convicts. Indentured laborers did not receive any skilled training like apprentices. However, like other forms of labor, they contributed to the growth of the colonies because of their payment of transportation costs in exchange for their promise to labor to pay this debt. In time, indentured servants became free to pursue their own labors without the slightest social stigma. The indentured system was going strong in the 1780s after the American Revolution, although no more British convicts were sent to America by then. In a pre-industrial colonial economy with a high demand for labor, this was the best system of the time. With the headright system in place in Virginia, indentured servants were bound by law and had to work 5 to 7 years in exchange for their sea passage, room and board paid for while they offered their labor in exchange for services. At the end of their terms, these bonded laborers were granted their freedom and provided a variety of forms of freedom dues that we know about. This might have included 2 sets of clothing, a monetary incentive represented either in cash or in the form, for example, of tobacco. And in regards to land, former indentured servants were never given land or property, and if it did happen, this was a rare occasion. What strata and age group were indentured servants? Mostly were young, unmarried men, about 75% of these, aged between 15 and 24. The other 25% were made up by women, ages 14 to 35. But families came as well, especially German-speaking peoples came in family groups. While serving one's contract for labor, legal aspects include the following. Because their time and labor belonged to their master, an indentured servant could not be jailed, as this would penalize the master's economic livelihood. Indentured servants couldn't be fined, as they had no money of their own. They could be punished publicly. If, when the indentured servant broke the law, their contracts could be extended. Personal limits and freedom while an indentured servant. Like all persons who could not afford to be financially independent, all indentured servants, while under contract, were not allowed to marry, move, change their contracts or employers. Women who got pregnant broke the law and contracts were extended. A master would be likely to give a well-behaved servant some time off, such as Sunday afternoon, to visit with friends or family. A master would be likely to give a well-behaved servant some small amount of spending money. But like apprentices, indentured servants were not supposed to be playing cards, gambling, or visiting taverns, or for that matter, creating families. They had to wait until their contract was completed, and then they left their master to live out their own lives. As you can see on this slide here, the overview is continued from 1660 to 1775. Indentured servant costs paid by the master to ship captains settled the immigrants' transportation costs. Their continuous labor for 7 years or more would repay their masters for transportation and their upkeep during their term of service and duty. Approximately 307,400 arrived between 1700 and 1775. And of these I've given you a basic breakdown. About half were free immigrants. About 17% were transported convicts from Britain. 30% or so arrived as indentured servants. 35% were Irish, 27% German, and 24% English and Welsh. there was about 12% or so that came from Scotland. Thus, as mentioned previously, about 2/3 of immigrants arrived from Europe as unfree colonists. The most popular destination for immigrants, free and unfree, included the following: Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, and New York. Philadelphia was the most popular. Between 1683 and 1775, 73% of the German-speaking immigrants arrived here. Pennsylvania became known as the best poor man's country. During the 1660s, the number of indentured servants coming to America was challenged by rumors of ill treatment and death, so many resisted moving to the British colonies. Because of this, Chesapeake Bay planters and other business-minded colonists took to the purchasing of slaves for a lifetime of service or accepting convicts transported to the colonies as a part of their sentence from 1718 to 1775. With tens of thousands of convicts shipped to America, this change in the labor force would lead in part to the development of a disgruntled post-indenture population. In addition, indentured servants or convict labor did not offer a consistent labor base, but apprenticeship, where it was applied, did. These were local children and youth, and this was a popular system in America until the 1880s, a customary educational practice. For Southern planters, the purchase of slaves, while much more expensive and foreign, made economic and political sense. Under mercantilism, an important principle to remember is that to ensure mercantilism, that it could work and benefit the national economy, British policies attempted through a series of laws to regulate colonial activities regarding trade and manufacturing. Until the Navigation Acts of 1651, British colonists were expected voluntarily to accept their role and ship back raw materials back to their homeland. The Navigation Acts of 1651 restricted trade by colonists to non-British ports. This included products of tobacco, sugar, cotton, wool, dyes, wood products, and molasses. Commodities Britain could not produce domestically, but that required importation. Because British American colonists were not necessarily shipping their goods back to Britain, Parliament had to swing into action. If colonists were not going to voluntarily ship their raw materials back to Britain itself, then it was up to the government to assist in regulating and enforcing this role. Mercantilism did not work unless colonial raw materials made their way back to British ports and manufacturing houses. Parliament subsidized English manufacturers to help undersell European competitors. Laws prohibiting colonists from manufacturing certain products in order to protect English manufacturers include the Woolen Acts of 1699, the Hat Act of 1732, and this would be followed later on with the Molasses Act of 1733. Colonial smuggling along the coast of New England and in the West Indies resulted in further regulations. This included the Plantation Duty Act of 1673, attempting to reduce smuggling. By the 1760s, West Indian sugar profits were huge. And because colonists customarily bribed customs duties officers, this also undermined mercantilism as far as the national economy. While this is a short list, I'd like you to think about the following in regards to the pattern of trade and the early modern Atlantic world. From Europe, manufactured products sent to Africa. From the West Indies, exports of citrus, sugar, molasses, and rum. From the colonies, salted fish, beef, and wheat sent to the West Indies. From the West Indies, slaves, sugar, molasses, and rum sent to the colonies. From the colonies, fish, furs, tobacco, timber, and rice to England. From England, manufactured goods sent to the colonies and beyond, including furniture, silver, dishes, tools, weaponry, clothing, and printed cloths and textiles, using techniques acquired from India. From Africa, slaves were sent to the West Indies and the colonies, along with ivory, gold, and rare woods in exchange for manufactured products sent from Europe and the colonies. As huge profits were tied to the growing of sugar and other plantation crops, European planters and absentee managing agents did not grow foodstuffs. This resulted in a healthy Atlantic maritime economy of trade in raw materials and manufactured goods. Food, manufactured home goods, and building materials all had to be imported. The first slaves in the New World were Native Americans. However, they did not work well for colonists because of the following. Number one, they refused to do agricultural labor. Number two, they died in great numbers because of the importation of smallpox from Europe, and they easily escaped into the wilderness. Colonists in labor-intensive economies such as rice, sugar, and tobacco turned to a more steady and foreign labor source such as African slaves as an alternative. Africans did not die as easily from tropical diseases. They were easily spotted as runaways in white towns. They could not run away easily because they did not know the land or language. Intertribal warfare in Africa made easy capture of slaves all along the west coast of Africa by tribal chieftains then resold to Europeans in their desire for labor in sugar plantations. It's important to remember that only 5% of African slaves were imported to North America between the 1600s and the 19th century, as compared with that of the West Indies and Brazil, the largest importers of African slaves.